Hello, subscribers. Hello, others. It's David Hoffman, filmmaker, very early in the morning, you can see. And I've chosen to speak with this guy way the hell out in Tbilisi, Georgia. And I don't mean Georgia in the United States. And he's lived a life, I think, more amazing than mine. So, as you know, I get a lot of people contacting me and wanting to share things with me. But I watch this guy you're about to see, and his life and his opinions are off the charts amazing to me. So I hope they will be to you. So I could ask him lots of questions, but I'm going to ask him about the things that you're asking me about. Are we, the 60s generation, and are you responsible for what has happened? Did we, you, us, really mess up?
There were some serious problems in the 60s. And in fact, the 60s, of course, I often look at the 60s as kind of starting with Kennedy's death and ending with the end of the Vietnam War. And to me, that is the whole period, kind of divided in the middle at about 1970. For me, the Big Bang is actually World War II. World War II, we sometimes today cannot actually picture how big World War II is, but it created such damage in the world. What it was, for instance, in America, when the GIs came home, they didn't really want to talk about it. They wanted to put it out of their mind. They wanted, they were given the GI Bill. They wanted to go ahead and live this nice, comfortable life, which sounds great. I mean, they had more money. They were able to go to school. They were able to send their children to school, which is where the 60s come in. People weren't talking too much about what was going on. So the children, as they would grow up, were, especially in this latter half of the 50s, were saying, well, what about the war? And what about, I mean, a lot of people think the Holocaust, for instance, everyone must have been talking about it right after the war. No, that didn't happen until the 60s and 70s, really. You know, that people started, I remember hearing whispers about it in the early 60s as a kid. There's this weird thing where, but so these questions are coming, and the problem was so much of the generation of people who went to the war did not have a good answer, nor could they talk about with their families what happened, which created, in my feeling, see, to me, it was like the psychic damage of the war. It was like this huge thing hit, and of course it was worse in other parts of the world. But in America, this huge thing hit, creating this weird deadness and of conformity, of silence. Not that everything was like that. There were certainly bubblings up of all sorts of other things happening in the 50s. The 50s weren't simply conformity by any means. But the general tone of society was like this, that you just didn't raise certain kinds of questions.
So we're a part of the 60s generation and kind of the silent 50s and the exploding 60s. Did we explode, in your opinion, way too far?
I think it did explode. And it exploded, like I say, I think Kennedy's death, so many of the younger people at the beginning of the 60s really looked up to Kennedy because he seemed to be a younger, fresher president. Upon his death, suddenly we often forget that the Beatles showed up in New York City in February of 1964. Well, Kennedy died in late November of 1963. The Beatles showed up, I think it was February 4th of 1964. And of course, they'd been playing them to death on the radio in places like New York prior to that. We often forget, if people today are old enough to remember September 11th, what was it like 2 months after September 11th? It wasn't like people were walking around just going back to normal. No, it was like the Beatles came and they were like this weird romantic replacement figure for so many people. That was one thing, but it starts kind of like this, it seems like the hula hoop. It just seems like a fad, but later in the year, the Berkeley free speech movement erupts. Bob Dylan's music changes, and changes so radically that it affects every other singer. Also, there are things coming from the beats and the folk protests. It's kind of like all these things are suddenly, and they seem to, Bob Dylan seems to be the lightning rod. Everything goes through Bob Dylan. The Beatles change in lyrics goes through Bob Dylan. It was known that Dylan was using drugs, although later he would back way off from that because he just couldn't do it. But no, suddenly, and then 67 is the year, it's kind of like the pump is being primed. And then culturally, 67 is the year, it's like, and I think what happens in 1967 is so huge. I think we're still feeling the effects of it today. That is to say, it opened up a crater. I look at it as all the unresolved questions that that the children could not get answered by the parents. They suddenly said, as many younger people today, all the people in the past were like hypocrites and they didn't answer our questions and they blew up. But you know what? The key of what happened in the 60s with the hippies, for instance, there's the hippies and then there's the political stuff of the New Left. But the key with the hippies was LSD. And LSD and other drugs turned them all into children. And the dominant hippie philosophy was, we're going to dance, we're going to sing. We don't even want to know there's a war. We just want to, if we just think good enough thoughts, it'll all disappear. It didn't. And in fact, what happened was, so many things happened in that moment, in the moment between, say, late 66 and 1969. It's like a crater opens up. I look at like, what is it? There's these huge Antarctic ice shelves. They seem like solid land, but they're actually these ice shelves. And then occasionally they break off from the mainland. And I think that's what happened. The past was sitting there, more or less connected all the way back through time. And suddenly this thing happens, it's like, and then it starts drifting. And we're living in this world now. For instance, a lot of people today will say, I'm a hippie. And I'll go like, no, you're not. Because I've met real hippies. And for one thing, what was interesting to me is hippies today are often, I don't know, kind of, people will say if you're into the environment or if you're into organic food or something, you're a hippie. Whereas the hippies that I knew were about searching for something beyond themselves. Also, they contained an awful lot of the folk protest movement in them. And they were also very, very literate as far as their reading habits. They were open to things in the way that one doesn't imagine, say, certain kinds of young, long-haired protesters who might claim the same banner to be.
How do you feel about the Christian search that was going on at that time?
This is complicated. Well, the basic facts were I came from a single parent home, just my mother. Already in the 1950s and such, divorce was becoming common. A lot of people don't believe it now, but back then you didn't move in with your boyfriend. But what you did instead was you got married to someone, then found it wasn't working, then got married again and found that wasn't working. So my mother went through 3 marriages by the time I was 7. And I grew up in kind of this weird state. I looked around because one of my stepfathers was very much an alcoholic. I saw what the hippies were doing and I saw the drug part. And I said to myself, there's some connection here between the drugs and the drinking. And I couldn't articulate it as a 13, 14-year-old, but I said, I don't want to do drugs. So I kind of said to myself, I wish there was I kind of liked something about the hippies, seemed honest. And I said, I wish there were hippies who weren't crazy and didn't do drugs, that kind of thing. Meanwhile, my own fascination with the music, I started growing my hair longer and stuff, but my own fascination with the music and all that was coming out, so much of the music during that particular period seems honest, people asking questions within the music. I mean, I could list endless songs like that, but by 1970, though, it seemed over. It's not that sex, drugs, and rock and roll ended. It's that the sex was just being kind of loose and the drugs was just getting high. It wasn't the cosmic quest anymore. And the music had started to become real commercial. And I wondered why, a few years ago we were having song questioning, why do we never get an answer when we're knocking at the door? And now we're listening to, I don't know, the Carpenters or Jackson 5 or the Osmonds. I'm going like, how did this happen? Well, I have since, of course, in my own way, researched exactly how it happened. I can tell you the names of the villains of the piece. One would be the Drake Association, who went around programming all the radio stations they could find in America. But for me, about 1970, I felt a particular sense of emptiness. And then I heard these weird Jesus people. We did not call ourselves Jesus freaks. I read something in Wikipedia recently where they said the term Jesus freak was used in approval. No, it wasn't. I mean, anyway, I met these people. Through a long story, I ended up becoming a Christian through them. I went and lived on these Jesus people communes in 1973. I got hooked up to a much larger cultural thing that was going on called the shepherding movement, which involved everyone reporting in on everyone's activities. I mean, after a while, who you married, what you did with your money, where you worked was all basically not totally laid out for you, but you had to report on everything. But I think I was just intelligent enough to realize that, oh, these people aren't actually following the Bible at this point. What they're following is something else. They were, in a sense, involved in a reaction against the hippies. I remained a Christian, but after that period, in fact, I ended up in Switzerland at this place called L'Abri, where it was L'Abri means shelter in French. And it was a place, actually, it was mostly in English there, but it was a place where people's questions were taken seriously. In a sense, they were still in the late 70s doing what the 60s were doing, that is to say, they realized that a lot of the problem was that people didn't have a place to get their questions answered, where people wouldn't take their questions seriously.
And are you still a Christian today?
Still a Christian today. And but I often tell people, probably not like one you've met before. Because I became very interested. I mean, I take a lot of things very seriously in the Bible, but I've never lost a lot of sleep trying to figure out if Genesis happened in 6 24-hour days or anything like that. Because I realized, well, hey, the ancient Hebrews didn't have a clock. They weren't worried about 24-hour days. This isn't what that story is about. They weren't literal minded in the same way we are. And for us, if we say something is a myth, we immediately say, oh, therefore it didn't happen. Whereas I think when I think C.S. Lewis said that it's a true myth, that it is something that happened, but I don't think it happened like a photograph.
There's one question I'm getting from so many of the people during this time of extreme partisan divide. And you did a video on that, a talk about the two worldviews and the fact that people don't seem to even hear the same thing. Some of my people want to go back to the 50s, and they believe that if we just return to the 50s, America would again be the global leader that it was. We would have money, we would have decent living, divorce would go away, women would return to the home from the workplace. There would be so little single parenting. There would be so much more controlled sexuality. We would be reasonable again. What is your feeling about that? Could we return?
No, it is impossible. And it's impossible, for one thing, people who think that the 1950s was this time where everything was normal, and if we could just get back there, it's like saying the Victorian age was a time when everything was normal. In fact, I look at the 50s as kind of a mini Victorian age. And the truth is, what they don't understand is all of there's a lot of people today who will talk about how on the left, there are people who want to take away your free speech. And I see that happening. But they don't realize that in the 50s, it was the right doing that. And that people were afraid to talk about their own opinions. For instance, the way I look right now, I could not have done this in the 1950s. I couldn't just hang out. I mean, a lot of what we take for granted today is part of the good results of the 1960s. There were good results, there were bad results. And unfortunately, the bad sometimes is much more colorful than the good. You know, and the truth is a lot of things were really bottled up in the 1950s. And the 1960s is the champagne cork going off. So it's kind of like, and it's both the champagne cork going off of celebration and the champagne cork going off of drunkenness. You know, yeah, no, you can't go back ever. You know, the question is, where are we going? And can we get to something that allows for more human freedom and that allows us to keep the good choices?
I thank you for this, and I hope that you feel that it's a good thing that we did this together.
David, I've enjoyed it. And if you want to do it again sometime, hit me up.